The steady beep of the heart monitor is the only heartbeat this room is supposed to have. But as the door creaked open, I heard two more, heavy, jagged, and smelling of cheap cigarettes and adrenaline. The doctors were here, but they didn't come to heal. I didn't turn around immediately. I kept my rhythm, the circular motion of the microfiber cloth against the bulletproof glass of the penthouse suite. To anyone watching, I was just part of the furniture. A private maid in a gray uniform, invisible, non-threatening, absorbed in the mindless task of erasing smudges from a view that cost $10,000 a night. My name tag said Tamika. To the hospital staff, I was the quiet woman who refilled the humidifiers and fluffed the pillows. They didn't know that 3 years ago, my name was Viper, and I wasn't paid to clean rooms, I was paid to clear them. The reflection in the window told me everything I needed to know. 2 males. Caucasian. Mid-30s. They wore white lab coats, but the fit was wrong. Too tight across the shoulders. Restricting movement. Doctors carry stethoscopes and clipboards. These men carried a distinct stiffness in their gait, the kind that comes from concealing a weapon at the small of the back. And they wore heavy, rubber-soled combat boots instead of hospital clogs. Amateurs. Or maybe just arrogant. They assumed the coma patient was a vegetable and the black maid was a non-entity. "Check the hallway," the taller one grunted. His voice was gravel, a smoker's rasp. "Clear," the second one muttered, locking the door behind them. The click of the deadbolt was loud in the sterile silence. I paused my wiping, just for a fraction of a second, letting my breathing shallow out. My heart rate didn't spike. It dropped. That was the training. That was the switch. The fear response was for civilians. For me, adrenaline was a fuel I carefully distilled into focus. The taller man approached the bed where Lim Won-Seog lay. They called him the Ghost King in the whispers of the underworld, a man so terrifying that even in a coma, his rivals didn't dare speak his name too loudly. I looked at him from the corner of my eye. He was beautiful in a terrifying sculptural way. Sharp cheekbones, raven hair fanned out against the white pillow, and hands that looked elegant but scarred. He looked like a sleeping prince from a dark fairy tale, but I knew better. Men like him didn't sleep. They waited. But right now, he was vulnerable. A tube down his throat, wires taped to his chest. The assassin reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a chart. He pulled out a syringe filled with a clear, viscous liquid. Potassium chloride, probably. A heart attack in a bottle. Clean. Untraceable. "Do it quick," the man by the door said, his eyes scanning the room, sliding right over me as if I were a lamp. "We have 3 minutes." The man with the syringe leaned over Won-Seog. He raised the needle to the IV port. I didn't think. I just moved. I dropped the cloth. The silence of the room shattered not with a scream, but with the sudden, violent rush of air. I crossed the 15 feet between the window and the bed in 3 strides, my footsteps silent on the sanitized tile. The man with the syringe sensed the movement too late. He started to turn, his mouth opening in surprise. I didn't give him time to speak. I grabbed his wrist with my left hand, twisting it outward until the radius snapped with a wet crunch, forcing him to drop the needle. Before he could scream, I drove the heel of my right palm upward, slamming into his nose, driving the cartilage back into his skull. He collapsed backward, gurgling, dead before he hit the floor. Welcome, my fierce hearts and midnight dreamers. If you've been riding with me, you know we don't do boy meets girl here. We do predator meets the one woman dangerous enough to save him. We do the kind of chemistry that's mixed with gunpowder and bad decisions. And if you're new, buckle the hell up, because you're about to witness a collision between a maid with a past she's buried and a mafia lord who has been watching her from the shadows of his own mind. This isn't just a romance. It's a war zone. Hit that like button before the first shot is fired. Subscribe because your obsession starts right now, and smash that notification bell, because in this world, silence gets you killed. Now, let's watch the man in the coma see everything. The second man, the one by the door, froze. It was a fatal hesitation. He stared at his partner's crumpled body, then at me. His brain couldn't process the image. The maid. The cleaning lady. The help. He fumbled for the gun at his back. A suppressed Glock 19. I recognized the matte black finish as it cleared his waistband. What the? I didn't let him finish. I grabbed the metal water pitcher from the bedside table. Heavy, stainless steel, condensation dripping down the sides. I hurled it with the precision of a fastball pitcher. It spun through the air and connected squarely with his temple. The hollow thud was sickeningly loud. He staggered, the gun clattering to the floor. I was on him before he could recover. I swept his legs, bringing him down hard. He tried to scramble away, his eyes wide with a primal terror, realizing too late that he was locked in a room with something far worse than a security guard. He tried to shout, to alert someone outside, but I dropped my knee onto his throat, pinning him to the linoleum. He clawed at my uniform, his fingernails tearing the fabric, but I didn't flinch. I stared into his eyes as the light faded from them, applying just enough pressure to crush the windpipe. It was intimate in a twisted way. The way life leaves a body is always the same. It's a fading spark, a surrender. When he finally went still, I stood up. The room was silent again. The only sound was the heart monitor, still beeping that steady rhythmic beat. Beep, beep, beep. Lim Won-Seog's heart hadn't skipped a beat. He lay there, perfectly still, oblivious to the violence that had just erupted 3 feet from his head. I exhaled, a long, slow breath through my nose, shaking out my hands. My pulse was steady. I looked at the carnage. 2 bodies, 1 syringe, 1 gun. Messy, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded foreign in the quiet room. Very messy, Tamika. I checked the time on the digital clock. 10:14 am. Rounds weren't for another 20 minutes. I had time. I dragged the bodies into the large, ensuite bathroom, stacking them in the bathtub like discarded mannequins. I'd have to deal with them later. Extraction, disposal, the logistics of a ghost life I thought I'd left behind. But right now, the room had to be perfect. I picked up the gun and tucked it into the waistband of my skirt, covering it with my apron. I retrieved the syringe and wrapped it in a paper towel, shoving it into my pocket. I picked up the metal pitcher, wiped it down with disinfectant, and placed it back on the table, exactly aligned with the coaster. Then, I got on my hands and knees. I scrubbed the scuff marks from the floor where the second man's boots had dragged. I wiped the microscopic spray of blood from the bedside rail. I worked with the same efficiency I used to strip a rifle, only now, my weapon was bleach and a rag. The smell of copper and sweat was replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of lemon antiseptic. Within 10 minutes, the room was pristine. The violence was erased. I was just the maid again. I walked over to the bed and looked down at Lim Won-Seog. He was so still. His chest rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm. I reached out, smoothing the blanket over his chest, my fingers brushing against the cold skin of his arm. He felt like marble. I leaned in close, checking the tape on his IV, making sure the struggle hadn't dislodged anything. His eyelashes were long, dark fans against his pale skin. There was a power radiating off him, even in this state. A gravity. I wondered what color his eyes were. I wondered if he knew how close he had just come to the end. I picked up my cleaning caddy, the weight of the hidden gun pressing against my spine, a familiar, comforting weight. I wasn't just Tamika Smith anymore. The Viper was awake, and the simple life I had built was bleeding out on the bathroom tiles. I paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. "You're lucky you're a ghost, Mr. Lim," I whispered into the stillness. "Ghosts don't have to see how ugly the world really is." I turned to leave, my hand on the doorknob, and then I felt it. It was subtle, like a static charge in the air, a sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck, raising the fine hairs there. It was the distinct, undeniable feeling of being watched. I froze. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My military instincts screamed at me that the threat assessment had changed. The room was empty save for me and the comatose man. The dead men were in the tub, the door was locked. So who was looking at me? The heart monitor beeped on, steady and mocking. Beep, beep, beep. I gripped the doorknob tighter, my knuckles turning white, forcing myself to open it and step out into the hallway. But the sensation followed me, a cold shiver down my spine, as if two dark eyes had snapped open the moment my back was turned, burning a hole through my uniform, marking me. I stood in the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me, sealing the dead assassins inside with the sleeping king. My back was pressed against the wood, and I held my breath, listening. The prickling sensation on my neck hadn't faded. It was a warning system I hadn't used since my protection detail days in Johannesburg, a biological radar that screamed danger long before a gun was drawn. The elevator at the end of the corridor chimed, a cheerful major key ding that sounded obscene in the tense silence. I didn't run. I stepped into the alcove of a linen closet, leaving the door cracked just an inch. The elevator doors slid open. 4 men stepped out. They weren't doctors. They wore bespoke suits that cost more than my entire year's salary, cut generously to hide the bulk of shoulder holsters. These were the Shadows, Won-Seog's personal elite guard. They moved in a diamond formation, eyes scanning the perimeter, hands hovering near their lapels. A wave of relief should have washed over me. The cavalry had arrived. I could step out, explain the intrusion, and hand over the responsibility. But I stayed in the shadows. I watched the lead guard, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow. He didn't look like a man rushing to check on his boss. He looked like a man clearing a perimeter. He tapped his earpiece. "Clean the floor," he murmured. "No witnesses. If the maid is here, remove her." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Remove her. Not question her. Not debrief her. Remove her. They were compromised. Or maybe this was just how the Ghost King's organization worked. Incompetence was punished by death, and being a witness was a capital offense. Either way, I was a loose end. And loose ends get cut. I slipped back into the suite before they rounded the corner, locking the deadbolt. I had maybe 3 minutes before they used a master key or a breaching charge. I looked at Won-Seog. He was still peaceful, the eye of the hurricane. "Change of plans, boss," I whispered, stripping off my apron. I moved with a speed that blurred the edges of the room. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for people who expect to survive by luck. I survived by procedure. I grabbed the transport tablet from the nurse's station near the window, a ruggedized device used for logging vitals. My fingers flew across the screen. I wasn't a hacker, but I knew hospital protocols. I accessed the patient transfer log, authorizing an emergency movement order for patient 404 to the sub-basement imaging wing. Reason: critical equipment failure. I tossed the tablet onto the bed and began decoupling him. This was the dangerous part. The monitors. The IVs. I had to switch him to portable. I clamped the lines, transferred the drips to the travel rack, and unlocked the wheels of his bed. He was heavy, dead weight in the truest sense, but the bed was designed to glide. I draped a sterile sheet over his face, covering those sharp features. To the world, he was now just a shape. A corpse or a surgical case. It didn't matter which. I heard the heavy footsteps outside the door. The handle jiggled. Then, the distinct metallic slide of a keycard. I rammed the bed through the side door that connected to the service corridor, the invisible artery of the hospital where the dirty laundry and the dead bodies traveled. I kicked the door shut just as the main entrance breached. I was in the liminal space now. The air here was different. It didn't smell of flowers and expensive perfume. It smelled of industrial bleach, wet concrete, and the ozone hum of massive generators. The lights overhead flickered with a sickly yellow buzz, casting long, jumping shadows against the cinderblock walls. I pushed the gurney, running in the low, silent sprint of a combat medic. The wheels hummed over the linoleum. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. I rounded the corner toward the freight elevator and skidded to a halt. A checkpoint. 2 guards were stationed by the heavy steel doors. They were big, bored, and scrolling on their phones. They looked up as I approached, their hands dropping to their belts. "Hold it," the one on the left barked. "Restricted access." No transfer orders came through. This was it. The Viper had to disappear. Tamika Smith, the invisible maid, had to take the stage. I let my shoulders slump forward, shrinking my silhouette by 2 inches. I hyperventilated for 3 seconds, forcing a flush to my cheeks, and widened my eyes until they watered. I wasn't the woman who had just snapped a hitman's wrist. I was the help. I was the terrified minimum wage worker who was just trying not to get fired. Please. I squeaked, my voice cracking perfectly. I shoved the tablet toward them, my hands shaking violently. Dr. Park is going to kill me. The machine in the suite shorted out. Look. He's dropping. I have to get him to the sub-basement or he dies on my shift. I frantically pointed at the portable monitor I had rigged to beep erratically. The guard looked at the tablet, then at the sheet-covered body, and finally at me. He saw the terror in my eyes. He saw the cheap uniform. He didn't see a threat. He saw a nuisance. Dr. Park is an ass, the guard muttered, glancing at the critical alert flashing on the screen I had forged. He swiped his badge across the sensor. Go. But if you scrape the paint on the elevator again, I'm reporting you. Thank you. Thank you. I sobbed, pushing the gurney past them, stumbling a little on purpose. As the heavy elevator doors closed, shutting out their faces, I stood up straight. The tears evaporated instantly. My breathing leveled out. I hit the button for the loading dock. 1 obstacle down. 100 miles to go. The loading dock was a sensory assault. The doors opened to a wall of noise, the torrential downpour of a Seoul monsoon hammering against the corrugated metal roof. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, wet asphalt, and rotting cardboard. I scanned the bay. There, a black medic transport SUV, idling near the ramp. The driver was outside, smoking a cigarette under the overhang, his back to me. I didn't have time for gentle. I parked the gurney by the rear doors, silently unlatched the hatch, and slid Won-Seog inside. He locked into the floor tracks with a solid click. I covered him with a thermal blanket found in the back. The driver turned at the sound, flicking his cigarette away. Hey. What are you doing? This is reserved for. I stepped into his personal space before he could finish the sentence. I didn't hit him. I didn't have to. I pressed the muzzle of the suppressed Glock, the one I'd taken from the assassin, into his gut. Drive, I whispered. Or die. Your choice. He chose life. He ran into the rain, disappearing into the night without looking back. I climbed into the driver's seat. The interior was a different world. It smelled of rich, new leather and pine air freshener. The silence inside was hermetic, sealing out the storm. I adjusted the seat, put the car in gear, and punched the gas. The engine growled, a high-performance beast disguised as a medical vehicle. We shot out of the loading dock and into the slick, neon-lit streets of the city. I drove fast but smooth, weaving through the traffic, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the glass. The rain drummed on the roof, a chaotic staccato that sounded like gunfire. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tight enough to creak. Why are you doing this, Tamika? The question echoed in my head, louder than the storm. I could have walked away. I could have left him for the shadows. I could be on a bus to Busan right now. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw the tiredness there, the weight of the debt. $200,000. That was the price tag my husband had left me with. Not gambling, not drugs, but a failing heart and an insurance company that knew how to read the fine print. He died anyway, and I was left with the bill and the silence. They called me the Black Widow back in my old unit, not because I killed my lovers, but because everyone around me seemed to die while I walked away without a scratch. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was cursed. But I wasn't going to let this man die on my watch. I needed the bonus his family promised for discretion. I needed to clear the ledger. I refused to let the debt bury me like it buried my husband. I wasn't doing this for love. I wasn't doing this for loyalty. I was doing this for the money. That's what I told myself. That was the lie that kept my hands steady. I pulled up to a red light at a deserted intersection. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the red glow of the traffic signal into a bloody haze. The city felt empty, abandoned to the water and the dark. I glanced up at the rearview mirror to check on my cargo. The interior lights of the SUV were dim, casting long shadows over the back seats. Won-Seog lay there, the thermal blanket pulled up to his chin. He looked like he was carved from ice. Then, I saw it. It wasn't a twitch. A twitch is a muscle spasm, a misfire of the nervous system. This was different. His head moved. It was a slow, deliberate rotation, just an inch to the left, just enough to align his face directly with the rearview mirror. My breath hitched in my throat. I stared at the reflection, my heart hammering against my ribs. His eyes were still closed. His breathing was still the shallow rhythm of the comatose. But the angle was perfect. If his eyes had been open, he would have been looking directly at me. A cold dread washed over me, heavier than the rain. He wasn't just resting. He wasn't just lucky to be asleep while I slaughtered Hitmen in his room. He had adjusted his position to get a better view of the driver. The light turned green. I didn't move. I sat there, the engine purring beneath me, realizing with a terrifying clarity that I hadn't kidnapped a helpless patient. I had invited a predator into my car. The Ghost King wasn't asleep. He was waiting, and he had been evaluating me since the moment I walked into his room. The transition from rain to snow happened at the 2,000-foot elevation marker. The relentless drumming of the monsoon on the roof of the SUV faded, replaced by the soft, muffling silence of falling snow. I watched the flakes hit the windshield, fat, wet clusters that looked like white ash falling from a burning sky. I steered the vehicle off the paved road and onto a gravel track that didn't exist on any GPS. This was my bolt hole, my burn bag property, purchased 3 years ago with cash I'd stripped from a cartel safe in Juarez, under a name that belonged to a dead woman. It was a hunting cabin perched on the lip of a granite ridge, surrounded by a dense thicket of Korean pine. It looked like a dark, abandoned tomb against the pristine whiteness of the snow, a wooden box designed to keep secrets. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was deafening. No sirens, no heart monitors. Just the wind whistling through the pines and the ticking of the cooling engine. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, letting the vibration in my hand settle. I was alone in the wilderness with the most dangerous man in South Korea. If I had miscalculated, if the shadows tracked the GPS before I jammed it, this cabin wouldn't be a sanctuary. It would be a grave. I pushed the door open. The cold hit me like a physical blow, biting through my thin maid's uniform. It smelled of pine needles, ozone, and the deep metallic scent of impending winter. I moved to the back of the SUV and threw open the hatch. Won-Seog was exactly as I had left him, a statue wrapped in a thermal blanket. "End of the line, Your Highness," I muttered, my breath pluming in the air. Getting him out wasn't graceful. It was physics. He was dead weight in the truest sense of the term, unconscious, uncooperative mass. But he wasn't soft. As I grabbed him by the shoulders to slide him onto the tailgate, I felt the density of him. He was solid muscle, heavy and compact. I didn't try to carry him bridal style, that's how you blow a disc in your back. I used the fireman's drag, locking my arms under his armpits, letting his heels drag in the snow. I leaned back, using my own body weight as a counter lever, and pulled. He was heavy. God, he was heavy. But there was something else, too. Through the thin fabric of his hospital gown and the thermal blanket, I could feel the heat radiating off him. He was a furnace. In the biting cold of the mountain air, his body was a shocking, vibrant source of warmth pressed against my spine. It was a reminder that he wasn't cargo. He was a man. A living, breathing, burning man. I dragged him up the wooden steps, gritting my teeth as my boots slipped on the icy planks. I kicked the door open and hauled him into the main room. The cabin was freezing, the air inside stale and smelling of damp wood and old ashes. I didn't stop to rest. I pulled him over to the rug in front of the cast iron wood stove. I left him there for a moment, a dark shape on the braided wool, while I went to work on the fire. I worked with mechanical efficiency. Kindling. Paper, a splash of kerosene, a match. The fire roared to life, sucking the stagnant air up the chimney. I lit the kerosene lamp on the table, the golden light flickering and chasing the shadows into the corners. Only then did I turn back to him. I needed to check him. The transport had been rough, and I had pulled him out of a sterile environment into a dusty cabin. I knelt beside him, the floorboards hard against my knees. I peeled back the thermal blanket. The firelight danced over his face, casting deep hollows under his cheekbones and making his eyelashes cast long spider-leg shadows on his cheeks. He looked peaceful. Too peaceful. "Let's see what you're made of," I whispered. I untied the back of his hospital gown. I needed to check for pressure sores, for popped stitches from whatever put him in the coma, for injuries from the extraction. I pulled the fabric down to his waist. I drew a sharp breath. I had expected a soft, atrophied body of a man who had been bedridden for months. I didn't find that. Lim Won-Seog's torso was a map of violence. A tapestry of scars told the history of his rise to power. There was a jagged, keloid scar running from his left shoulder to his sternum. A knife fight, probably. A puckered circular mark on his lower ribs, a small-caliber bullet entry wound, and faint white lines across his forearms that looked like defensive burns. But it wasn't just the scars. It was the build. Even in repose, his abdominals were defined, his pectorals hard. He looked like a sleeping tiger, terrifyingly beautiful and inherently dangerous. I placed my hand on his chest to check his heart rate. My palm looked small and dark against his pale, scarred skin. His heart beat strong and slow under my hand. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. It was a powerful rhythmic surge that vibrated up my arm. For a second, the professional veneer cracked. I wasn't Viper, the close protection specialist. I was Tamika, a woman alone in a cabin with a man who looked like a fallen god. I felt a strange magnetic pull, a desire to trace the line of that scar with my thumb, to feel the texture of his skin. I snatched my hand back. "Focus. You are not a fan. You are his jailer." I remembered the car, the movement in the mirror, the adjustment of the head. I narrowed my eyes at him. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I said softly. He didn't twitch. His breathing didn't hitch. I decided to push harder. I needed to know. I leaned in close, my lips inches from his ear. I let my voice drop to a cold, cruel whisper. "I didn't bring you here to save you, Won-Seog. I brought you here to sell you. The shadows? They didn't want to kill you. They wanted to reinstate you. But I intercepted the transfer. Your empire is burning, and I'm going to sell the ashes to the highest bidder." It was a lie. A vicious, calculated lie designed to trigger a rage response. If he was awake, if he was the king they said he was, that statement should have spiked his heart rate. It should have caused a micro-tremor in his eyelid. I watched him like a hawk. Nothing. His heart rate remained steady. His face remained a mask of marble indifference. I sat back on my heels, frustrated and confused. Was I imagining it? Was the paranoia finally eating holes in my brain? Maybe the movement in the car was just the vibration of the engine. Maybe he really was just a coma patient, and I was just a kidnapping victim of my own making. I pulled the gown back up and tucked the thermal blanket around him, covering the scars and the muscle. "Fine," I muttered, standing up and wiping my hands on my apron. "Play dead. See if I care." I was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the hit, the extraction and the drive was crashing. My limbs felt like lead. The heat from the stove was permeating the room now, a soporific weight that dragged at my eyelids. I pulled a heavy wooden chair over to the fire, positioning it so I was facing him. I sat down, the old wood groaning under me. I checked the magazine of my Glock, full, and rested it in my lap, my hand loosely gripping the handle. "I'm watching you," I told the sleeping man. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane, but inside, the only sound was the crackle of the wood and the steady breathing of the Ghost King. I watched the flames dance in the reflection of the glass. My eyes grew heavy. I fought it for a while, blinking hard, shifting my weight, but the warmth was too seductive. My chin dropped to my chest. Darkness, Then, a dream. Or a memory. I was floating in a dark ocean. The water was warm, not cold. A hand brushed against my cheek. It was rough, calloused, but the touch was incredibly gentle. It tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. I leaned into the touch, seeking the warmth. "Rest, little viper," a voice whispered. It sounded like gravel and velvet. "You've done well." I jerked awake. My heart hammered in my chest. I gripped the gun, raising it instantly, scanning the room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The cabin was dimmer, the shadows longer. I looked at the rug. Lim Won-Seog hadn't moved. He was still on his back, his head turned slightly to the side, his breathing deep and even. I let out a breath, lowering the gun. "Just a dream," I whispered, rubbing my face. "Get it together, Tamika." I went to stand up to add more wood to the fire, but I froze. I looked closer at him. When I fell asleep, I had thrown the thermal blanket over him loosely. It had been bunched around his waist and chest. Now, the blanket was pulled up high, tucked neatly and tightly under his chin, smoothing out the wrinkles. And more than that, my own travel shawl, which I had left on the table across the room, was draped over my shoulders. I touched the wool of the shawl, my fingers trembling. I looked at the man on the floor. He looked exactly the same. But in the dim light of the dying fire, the corner of his mouth seemed to hold the faintest, ghostly trace of a smile. He wasn't just awake, he was taking care of me. And that was infinitely more terrifying than if he had tried to kill me. The light that filtered into the cabin wasn't the warm gold of a morning sun. It was the blue, bruised light of a snowstorm's aftermath. This was the blue hour, that suspended moment between night and day where the world feels frozen in amber. I sat in the wooden chair, my muscles locked in a rigor of exhaustion and tension. I hadn't slept since the dream. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand, scratching against my eyelids every time I blinked. But my mind was razor sharp. I looked down at the shawl draped over my shoulders. It was a coarse wool blend, gray and unassuming. I had left it on the table, 10 feet away from where I had fallen asleep. Now, it was wrapping me in warmth. I slowly peeled it off, handling it like it was contaminated evidence. I dropped it onto the floor. He was playing with me. I looked at Lim Won-Seog. He lay on the rug, the thermal blanket rising and falling with the infuriatingly perfect rhythm of the innocent. He looked harmless. He looked like a fallen angel waiting for a resurrection. But I knew better. The shawl didn't walk across the room on its own. The blanket didn't tuck itself. The nurse was gone. The maid was dead. The viper was back. And she was pissed. "Okay," I whispered, my voice raspy from the dry mountain air. "You want to play games? Let's play." I stood up, the floorboards groaning under my boots. I walked to the kitchenette, which was little more than a hot plate and a sink that smelled of rust. I opened a can of cold peaches with my combat knife, eating the slices straight from the tin, the syrup sticky on my fingers. The sugar hit my bloodstream like a drug, sharpening my focus. I didn't offer him any. I walked back to the center of the room and dragged the heavy chair closer to him, the legs screeching against the wood. I sat down, leaning forward, my elbows on my knees. I pulled my Glock from my waistband. I ejected the magazine. Click. I racked the slide, ejecting the chambered round. Clack. I began to strip the weapon, the metallic sounds sharp and violent in the quiet room. "You know, Mr. Lim," I said, my voice conversational, almost bored. "I've been thinking about the economics of this situation. The market is volatile right now." I scrubbed the barrel with a cloth. He didn't move. "See, I did some research on your competitors while you were sleeping," I lied. "Director Choi, the man who runs the Busan ports. Rumor has it he's been trying to carve up your territory for years. He's a butcher, they say. Doesn't believe in quick deaths. He likes to dismantle things slowly. Empires. People." I paused, watching his face. A muscle in his jaw? A twitch in his finger? Nothing. He was a stone. "I have his encrypted contact frequency," I continued, reassembling the slide spring. Snap. I bet he'd pay double what your family is offering just to have the Ghost King delivered to his doorstep. Gift-wrapped. Unconscious. Helpless. I slammed the magazine back in. The sound was a final punctuation mark. In fact, I stood up, looming over him. I think I'll call him after I finish my coffee. Why save a kingdom that's already burning? Still nothing. His discipline was terrifying. He was either the deepest sleeper in medical history, or he possessed a level of self-control that bordered on the inhuman. I needed to break the seal. Words weren't enough. I needed physical stimulus. I went to my med kit. I dug past the bandages and the morphine syringes until I found what I was looking for. A 10cc syringe and a vial of sterile saline solution. It was harmless, salt water. But he didn't know that. I filled the syringe, flicking the side to clear the air bubbles. A tiny droplet of liquid sprayed from the tip, catching the blue morning light. I walked back to him. I knelt down, invading his personal space. I was close enough to smell him now, the scent of the hospital antiseptic fading, replaced by the natural, musky scent of a man. "You seem dehydrated," I whispered. "Let's fix that. But I'm all out of the good stuff. This is a little cocktail we used in the darker parts of the service. It's a stimulant. It feels like liquid fire in the veins. It wakes you up, screaming." I grabbed his left arm. It was heavy, the muscles yielding but dense. I rolled up the sleeve of his gown. I found a vein in the crook of his elbow, tracing the blue line with my thumb. "Last chance to wake up the easy way, Your Highness," I murmured. I brought the needle down, the tip hovering a millimeter above his skin. I watched his eyes. I was looking for the REM flutter, the rapid eye movement that happens when the brain panics, even when the body stays still. I waited for the flinch. Crack. The sound came from outside. It was loud, sharp, like a rifle shot or a heavy boot snapping a dry branch. My head snapped up, my eyes darting to the cabin door. My heart slammed against my ribs. The shadows? A bear? The wind? For a split second, less than a heartbeat, my attention left the man on the floor. My survival instinct overrode my interrogation. I shifted my weight, reaching for the gun on the floor. That split second was all he needed. I felt a sudden violent clamping sensation on my right wrist, the hand holding the syringe. It wasn't a weak, trembling grasp. It was a vice. Steel fingers locked around my bones, halting the needle's descent instantly. I gasped, looking down. Lim Won-Seog's eyes were open. They weren't groggy. They weren't confused. They were dark, endless voids of obsidian, sharp and alert. And they were locked onto mine with a predatory intensity that froze the air in my lungs. He didn't look like a patient. He looked like a trap that had finally sprung. I tried to yank my hand back, but he held fast. He used my own momentum against me, twisting his hips and pulling me down. I lost my balance, crashing forward. My free hand slammed into the floorboards to catch myself, leaving my face inches from his. The syringe skittered across the floor, useless. The power dynamic in the room flipped in a single breath. I was the one hovering over him, but he was the one holding the leash. He stared at me, his gaze dissecting me, peeling back the layers of Tamika Smith to find the viper underneath. He didn't blink. Then, he spoke. His voice was a wreckage. It was the sound of tectonic plates grinding together, deep, jagged, and ruined by weeks of disuse and the intubation tube. But beneath the gravel, there was silk. A dark, commanding authority that didn't need volume to be terrified. "Director Choi," he rasped, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Choi is a hammer. He lacks finesse. He tightened his grip on my wrist, not enough to break it, but enough to remind me that he could. "And you," he continued, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned my face, "you are terrible at cleaning windows. You missed a spot in the upper left corner. I watched you miss it for 3 weeks." My breath hitched. He had been watching. Every day, every wipe of the cloth, every secret glance I stole at him. He had been there, behind the glass of his own eyes, recording everything. He pulled me a fraction of an inch closer, the heat of his body radiating up to meet mine. You said ghosts don't have to see how ugly the world is, he whispered, throwing my own words from the hospital back in my face. You were wrong, Tamika. The ghosts are the only ones who see everything, because nobody bothers to hide their sins from the dead. He finally released my wrist, the sudden absence of his grip leaving a burning phantom pressure on my skin. He didn't try to take my gun. He didn't try to attack me. He just lay there, staring up at me, a king holding court from the floorboards. Now, he said, his voice dropping to a command. Help me up. My legs have been asleep for a month, and I am starving. The demand hung in the air, vibrating with a confusing mix of frailty and absolute command. Help me up. I didn't move immediately. My brain was still trying to recalibrate the threat assessment. The man on the floor wasn't a vegetable. He wasn't a victim. He was a wolf who had been patiently waiting for the cage door to open. But as I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw the cracks in the armor. His skin was pale, translucent like parchment. His hands, though steady in their grip on my wrist earlier, now possessed a fine rhythmic tremor. The spirit was willing, and the mind was sharp, but the flesh was atrophied. You can't walk, I said, my voice flat. Your muscles have degraded. You'll collapse. Then drag me, he rasped, his eyes burning. But get me off this floor. I prefer to die on my feet. I holstered my weapon, not because I trusted him, but because he was right. If we were going to have this conversation, it wouldn't be with me towering over him. I stepped in, sliding my arm under his shoulder, grabbing his waist with my other hand. On 3, I muttered. 1, 2, 3. I heaved. He pushed. It was a messy, uncoordinated struggle against gravity. He was heavy, a dead weight of dense bone and muscle that hadn't carried itself in months. As he rose, his legs buckled instantly. I caught him, taking his full weight against my side. For a moment we were tangled together, my face buried in the crook of his neck, his arm draped heavily over my shoulders. The heat coming off him was intense, a feverish warmth that seeped through my uniform. I could feel the erratic, thundering beat of his heart against my ribs, not from fear, but from the sheer exertion of standing. Steady, I whispered, adjusting my stance to support him. I'm fine, he lied, sweat already beading on his forehead. He wasn't fine. He was shaking. But he refused to lean fully. He stood there, swaying slightly, forcing his neurons to reconnect with his limbs through sheer force of will. And then, the sound cut through the cabin walls. It was faint at first, swallowed by the wind, but then it grew sharper. A high-pitched, mechanical whine. Then another, and another, like a swarm of angry wasps descending from the mountain peaks. My head snapped toward the window. Snowmobiles, I hissed. Won-Seog didn't look at the window. He looked at the door. His eyes narrowed, stripping away the pain and exhaustion, replaced by a cold, geometrical calculation. Choi, he said. It wasn't a question. He sends scouts first. 4 men. 2 on the machines to suppress, 2 on foot to breach. Standard pincer movement. I looked at him, surprised. How do you know? Because I wrote the manual he's using, he said grimly. They'll hit the front to draw fire. The kill team comes from the back, the kitchen window. It's the blind spot. The whine of the engines was deafening now, a roar that vibrated the floorboards. I need a weapon, he demanded. You can barely hold yourself up, I countered, dragging him toward the heavy oak dining table. I shoved him down behind it, flipping it onto its side to create a barricade. Stay down. Don't die. I'm not losing my payday. Tamika. I didn't listen. I moved. The Viper took over. The transition was instant. The cold calculation of the combat medic replaced the anxiety of the maid. I killed the kerosene lamp, plunging the cabin into the gray gloom of the storm. I moved to the front window, pressing my back against the wall, peering through the crack in the curtains. 2 black shapes were circling the cabin on snowmobiles, kicking up rooster tails of white powder. They were armed with submachine guns, spraying the cabin indiscriminately. Crack thwack. Crack thwack. Bullets tore through the wood, sending splinters flying. A window shattered, the glass spraying inward like diamond dust. The wind howled into the room, carrying the freezing snow with it. Suppression fire, Won-Seog's voice came from behind the table. It was calm, almost bored. "They're making noise. Watch the back." He was right. The noise was a distraction. I spun around, sprinting low toward the kitchenette. The kitchen window exploded inward. A figure in white winter camo vaulted through the frame, boots crunching on the glass. He raised a rifle. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I flowed. I slid on my knees, coming up under his guard. I fired twice. Pop. Pop. 2 rounds to the center mass. The suppressor on my Glock made the shots sound like heavy coughs. The man crumpled backward out the window, a stain of red blooming on the white snow. "One down," I called out. "Second one is already in," Won-Seog warned. "Listen." I froze. The front door kicked open with a thunderous crash. The second breacher. He was big, wearing tactical armor, moving with speed. He spotted me in the kitchen. He raised an MP5. I dove behind the cast iron stove as a hail of bullets chewed up the floorboards where I had been standing a second ago. The sound was deafening in the small space, the metallic ping of rounds hitting the stove, the thud of lead burying itself in the logs. I was pinned. If I poked my head out, I was dead. If I stayed, he would flank me. Surrender. The man shouted, his voice muffled by a balaclava. "We only want the ghost. Come and get him." I yelled back, checking my magazine. 3 rounds left. Not enough. I heard his boots crunching on the floor. He was moving to my right. He was closing the angle. I braced myself, gripping the knife in my boot. I'd have to let him get close. Too close. The footsteps stopped. He had a clear line of sight on the overturned table. He was going to execute Won-Seog first, then deal with me. No. I screamed, scrambling to get up, knowing I was too late. Phut. A single, dry sound, like a book being slammed shut. The gunman jerked violently. His head snapped forward, a spray of pink mist erupting from his temple. He dropped straight down, his weapon clattering uselessly on the floor. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and ringing. I stared at the dead man, then slowly turned my head toward the table. Lim Won-Seog was sitting up, his back propped against the overturned oak. He was pale as a sheet, sweat soaking his hospital gown. His hands were shaking violently now, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. But in his right hand, resting on his knee, was a compact Sig Sauer P365, my backup gun, the one I had hidden under the loose floorboard beneath the rug, the one I hadn't told anyone about. He looked at me, his chest heaving, the gun smoking slightly in the freezing air. "You hide things well, Tamika," he wheezed, a dark amusement dancing in his eyes. "But I find things better." I lowered my weapon, exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding. "You were awake when I hid that. Last night. I was resting my eyes," he murmured. The sound of the snowmobiles outside had stopped. The drivers were waiting for the all-clear signal that wasn't coming. "They'll realize the team is dead in about 60 seconds, Won-Seog said, struggling to push himself up again. "Then they'll use grenades. We have to go." "Go?" I snapped, moving to him. "Go where? It's a blizzard out there. Better to freeze than to burn," he stated. "The woods. We head for the ridge. The snowmobiles can't follow us into the dense timber." He was right. Again. I holstered my gun and grabbed his arm, hauling him up. He groaned, a low sound of pain that he tried to suppress. But he stood. I grabbed 2 heavy parkas from the hooks by the door. I threw one at him. "Put this on. If you die of hypothermia, I don't get paid." I grabbed the go bag I kept packed. Ammo. First aid. Flares. I shoved a fresh magazine into my Glock. The cabin, my safe haven, was now a trap. The wind howled through the broken windows, swirling snow around our feet. The smell of gunpowder and blood was thick and metallic, overpowering the scent of pine. We moved to the back door, stepping over the body of the man I had killed. Won-Seog paused at the threshold. He looked at me. The hood of the parka cast a shadow over his face, but I could see the glint of his eyes. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray curl of hair from my forehead. His touch was cold, but his gaze was scorching. He looked at the dead men, then back at me. A slow, predatory smirk curved his lips, a terrifying expression that promised violence to anyone who stood in our way. "You're a beautiful weapon, Tamika," he whispered, his voice gaining a jagged edge of strength. "It's a shame you've been wasting your time as a maid." "I'm not a weapon," I said, opening the door into the whiteout. "I'm the woman saving your ass. Try to keep up, Ghost King." "Lead the way, Viper," he replied. We stepped out into the storm, leaving the shelter behind, disappearing into the white void just as the first explosion tore the cabin apart behind us. The wind didn't just blow, it hunted. It screamed through the trees like a banshee, tearing at our clothes and freezing the moisture in our lungs before we could even exhale. This wasn't a storm, it was a white wall of erasure, designed to scrub us from the face of the earth. I couldn't feel my feet anymore. They were just heavy, numb stumps, clumsily navigating the deep drifts. But the weight on my shoulder was real. Lim Won-Seog was heavier with every step, his arm draped over me like a lead pipe. He was fighting, God knows he was fighting, but the human body has limits, and he had been horizontal for 3 months. "Leave me," he grunted, the words torn away by the gale. "You can move faster alone." "Shut up," I snapped, shouting to be heard over the roaring wind. "I don't leave my luggage behind." We trudged on for another 10 minutes, the world reduced to a gray-white blur. I was navigating by instinct, following the slope of the terrain, looking for a shadow, a break, anything. Then I saw it, a fissure in the granite ridge. A shallow overhang protected by a cluster of fallen boulders. It wasn't a hotel, but it was out of the wind. "There," I yelled, hauling him toward the darkness. We collapsed into the shelter. The silence was sudden and shocking. The wind still howled, but it was outside now, a frustrated beast scratching at the stone. Won-Seog slid down the rock wall, hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud. He didn't move. His head lolled forward, chin to his chest. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. Not the professional panic of losing a principal, but something jagged and personal. "Hey." I dropped to my knees, grabbing his face. His skin was terrifyingly cold. "Stay with me, Won-Seog. Don't you dare quit on me now." I ripped off my gloves, pressing my hands to his cheeks, trying to transfer my heat to him. I checked his pulse. It was there, thready, fast, fluttering like a trapped bird. I had to get him warm. Now. "I'm sorry," I muttered, "but this is going to get cozy." I unzipped his parka and mine, pulling us together until there was no air left between us. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in the crook of his neck, forcing my body heat to bleed into his. I could feel the ridge of his scars through the layers of clothes, the solid, unyielding reality of him. "Come on," I whispered into his skin. "Wake up." Minutes passed. The darkness of the cave seemed to press in. Then, I felt it. A hitch in his breathing. A deepening. The shudder of a man coming back from the edge. He shifted, his arms tightening around me. It wasn't the desperate grip of a drowning man anymore. It was firm, possessive. "You smell like gunpowder and vanilla," he murmured. I pulled back slightly, just enough to see his face in the gloom. The exhaustion was still there, etched into the lines around his eyes, but the fog was gone. The eyes that looked back at me weren't glassy. They were obsidian hard. The Ghost King was waking up. "You were crashing," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Hypothermia." "I was resting," he corrected, a faint smirk touching his lips, "and enjoying the view." He didn't let go. If anything, he pulled me closer. The dynamic in the small cave shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that had nothing to do with the storm. "Why?" I asked. The question tumbled out before I could stop it. "Why did you stay under? You were awake. You could have ended it weeks ago. Why lay there and let them think you were weak? He looked past me, staring into the swirling white chaos outside the cave mouth. His expression hardened, losing the trace of humor. Because I was bored, Tamika, he said. The rasp in his voice was fading, replaced by a smooth, dark baritone that vibrated in his chest against mine. Do you know what it takes to build an empire? It takes blood, buckets of it, and after a while, you forget why you're spilling it. I woke up from the surgery, heard them plotting, and I just didn't care. I wanted to see who would stay loyal. I wanted to see who would try to hold the crown. He turned his gaze back to me. It was intense, stripping me bare. And then, he continued, his voice dropping an octave. I saw you. My breath hitched. I was just the maid. You were the only thing in that room that was real, he said softly. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. His hand was warming up. Everyone else was acting. The doctors were pretending to care. The guards were pretending to protect. But you were efficient. You were silent. You moved like a dancer and cleaned like a soldier. I watched you for weeks. I learned the rhythm of your breathing. I learned that you hum when you think no one is listening. I stayed under because, for the first time in 10 years, I found something worth watching. The confession hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. He hadn't stayed for the strategy. He had stayed for me. I opened my mouth to speak, to push him away, to pull him closer, I didn't know which. Crunch. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible against the wind. The sound of a boot compressing fresh snow. I froze. The viper instinct slammed back into place. I reached for the Glock at my hip. Wait, Won-Seog whispered. His hand clamped over mine, stopping me. He didn't look at me. He looked at the entrance of the cave. His body didn't tense up. It relaxed. It was the terrifying relaxation of a predator who has just spotted a limping gazelle. Watch, he commanded. A figure appeared in the opening. A man in white winter gear, goggles over his eyes, a rifle raised. One of Choi's trackers. He had found our trail before the snow covered it. He squinted into the darkness of the overhang, seeing our huddled shapes. He raised the rifle barrel. Got you, the tracker grunted. Won-Seog moved. It wasn't the movement of a recovering patient. It was a blur, an explosion of kinetic energy stored up over months of stillness. He didn't stand up. He launched himself from the seated position, a coiled spring releasing. He stayed low, diving under the barrel of the rifle before the tracker could squeeze the trigger. He slammed into the man's knees, the impact sounding like a wet slap. The tracker buckled, falling forward. Won-Seog didn't scramble. He flowed. He rose with the man's fall, pivoting behind him. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. He wrapped his forearm around the tracker's throat, locking his other hand behind the man's head. A blood choke. But he didn't just hold it. He twisted. There was a sickening crack. The tracker went limp instantly, dropping like a sack of stones. Won-Seog stood over the body, his chest heaving, steam rising from his shoulders. He looked down at the dead man with a look of utter indifference. Then, he reached down and stripped the rifle and the ammunition belt from the corpse. He checked the chamber of the rifle, the mechanical clack-clack echoing off the stone walls. He turned slowly to face me. He looked terrifying. His hair was matted with snow, his hospital gown was torn and stained with mud and blood, and the stolen parka hung open. He looked like a god of winter, ancient and violent. The weakness was gone. The tremors were gone. The man who needed my help to walk was dead. The Ghost King had taken his place. He walked toward me. I backed up until my shoulders hit the rough stone of the cave wall. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I wasn't afraid he would hurt me. I was afraid of the dark, magnetic pull radiating off him. He stopped inches from me. He dropped the rifle to the ground. He placed both hands on the wall on either side of my head, caging me in. He leaned down, his face close enough that I could feel the heat of his breath on my lips. "You saved my life, Tamika," he whispered, his eyes dark and hungry, scanning my face. You dragged me off the floor. You killed for me. You kept me warm. He pressed his body against mine, pinning me to the cold stone. The friction was electric. The maid saved my life, he growled, his voice vibrating through my bones. But the maid is gone now. He tilted his head, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, sending a shiver violently down my spine. Now, he murmured, let's see what the viper does when she's finally caught. The words hung in the freezing air between us, heavy with implication and a dark, twisted intimacy. He was caging me in, his hands planted on the rock wall on either side of my head, his body a wall of solid, radiating heat against the biting cold. For a second, just a split second, the woman in me wanted to lean into him. The adrenaline from the kill was still coursing through my veins, mixing with the sudden, shocking return of the man I had been dragging through the snow. He wasn't a patient anymore. He was a force of nature. And God help me, I was drawn to the danger of him. But then the soldier kicked in. The viper woke up and realized she had been played. I didn't melt, I exploded. I slammed my hands against his chest, right over the scars I had inspected just hours ago, and shoved him with every ounce of strength I had left. Get off me. He stumbled back a step, not from my strength, but from the surprise of it. He caught his balance easily, his boots digging into the dirt floor of the cave. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. That dark, predatory smirk was still playing on his lips, infuriatingly arrogant. Don't touch me, I hissed, my voice shaking with a rage that felt volcanic. And don't you dare look at me like that, like I'm some prize you just won at a carnival. I don't play carnival games, Tamika, he said smoothly, crossing his arms over his chest. The movement caused the muscles in his forearms to flex, a reminder of the violence he had just inflicted on the tracker. And you are certainly no prize. A prize is passive. You are active. I'm a joke to you, I spat, pacing the small confines of the overhang, kicking up dust. That's what this was. The whole time. 3 weeks, Won-Seog. 3 weeks I cleaned your room. I wiped your face. I changed your IVs. I talked to you because I thought you were the only person in the world who couldn't judge me. And you were there. You were awake, listening, judging, laughing. I spun on my heel to face him, pointing a finger at his chest. You violated me. You invaded my head. You let me think I was safe, that I was invisible, while you were taking notes. He stopped smiling. The amusement drained from his face, replaced by a cold, hard stoicism that made the temperature in the cave drop 10 degrees. Safety is an illusion, he stated, his voice devoid of apology, and invisibility is a tool. You of all people should know that, Viper. You wore that maid's uniform like a suit of armor. You hid your lethal skills behind a bottle of Windex and a bowed head. You lied to the world every single day you walked into that hospital. Why is my lie so much worse than yours? Because my lie didn't involve watching you sleep. I shouted, the sound echoing off the stone. My lie was for survival. Your lie was for, what, power? Paranoia? Yes, he answered simply. Both. He took a step toward me. I backed up, my hand instinctively dropping to the knife sheathed in my boot. Do you know why I was in that bed, Tamika? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. I didn't trip. I didn't have a stroke. I was poisoned. By my own brother. At a family dinner. He smiled at me, toasted to my health, and watched me choke on my own blood. That is the world I live in, a world where blood means nothing and loyalty is sold to the highest bidder. He took another step. So yes, I faked the coma. Yes, I lay there while they circled like vultures. I needed to see who would cry and who would check for a pulse. I needed to know who would try to finish the job. He was looming over me again, his dark eyes burning with a cold fire. And then you walked in. You weren't a vulture. You were a hawk. Efficient. Sharp. And completely uninterested in my empire. You were the variable I didn't account for. I'm not a variable. I snapped, my hand gripping the hilt of the knife. I'm the person holding the bill. You owe me, Won-Seog. You owe me for saving your life. You owe me for the risk. And you owe me for the humiliation of letting me act like a fool while you watched. I never thought you were a fool, he said softly. I thought you were magnificent. The compliment hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my anger. It wasn't flowery. It wasn't romantic. It was an objective assessment of my lethality. And coming from him, a man who killed with the ease of breathing, it was intoxicating. Don't try to charm me, I warned, pulling the knife. The blade flashed in the dim light. I'm not one of your fangirls. I'm the Black Widow. Remember? He looked at the knife. Then he looked at my eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He stepped forward. I know exactly who you are, he murmured, closing the distance until the tip of my blade was pressing against the fabric of his parka right over his heart. Tamika Smith. Former military. Dishonorable discharge. Unjustified, in my opinion. Widow of Marcus Smith. Left with 200,000 in debt and a reputation for bad luck. My blood ran cold. How do you— I told you, he interrupted. I have resources. Even from a hospital bed. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the blade of the knife. Not the handle. The blade. He gripped the steel with his bare hand, ignoring the edge. You think you're cursed, he said, his voice rough. You think everyone you touch dies. That's why you push people away. That's why you hide in the shadows. He leaned in, pressing his chest against the point of the knife, daring me to push, daring me to cut him. But I am already dead, Tamika. I am the Ghost King. You can't kill a ghost. And your curse doesn't work on me. I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the overwhelming intensity of him. He was crazy. He was holding a knife blade, cutting his own palm, just to prove a point, just to bridge the gap between us. You're insane, I whispered. I am necessary, he corrected. He slowly pulled the knife from my grasp. I let him take it. I was paralyzed by the look in his eyes, a mixture of challenge and raw, undeniable hunger. He tossed the knife to the side. It clattered against the rock wall. He grabbed my wrists, pinning them against his chest. I could feel the warmth of his blood on his palm where the blade had bitten him. You're angry, he said, his voice dropping to a velvet rumble. Good. Use it. Anger is fuel. Hate me if you want. Hate me for lying. Hate me for watching. But do not tell me that you don't feel this. He pressed closer. Our bodies were flush against each other, separated only by layers of winter gear, but the connection was electric. I could feel the hard planes of his body, the power he was holding back. I feel like I should kill you myself, I breathed, looking up at him. Maybe you should, he countered, his gaze dropping to my lips. It would be a hell of a story. The air in the cave was thick, suffocating with unresolved tension. We were enemies. We were allies. We were a maid and a king, a soldier and a monster. And in that moment, I didn't know if I wanted to stab him or kiss him, until we both stopped breathing. The low mechanical growl of engines vibrated through the cave floor. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. The spell broke. We both froze. The sound of engines. Not one or two. A swarm. Won-Seog released my wrists instantly. The lover, or whatever the hell he was trying to be, vanished. The general returned. He moved to the mouth of the cave, peering out into the whiteout. They're sweeping the grid, he said, his voice flat and clinical. Choi has escalated. He's brought the heavy hitters. They'll be on top of us in 10 minutes. He turned back to me. The blood from his hand dripped onto the snow, a stark red contrast to the white. I looked at him. I was still furious. I was still reeling from the revelation of his surveillance. But the anger was cold now, sharpened into a weapon. He held out his uninjured hand to me. It was an invitation, a challenge. We have a problem, Viper, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. We can stand here and fight each other. We can settle the score of who lied to who and who owes what. And while we do that, they will surround us and burn us out of this hole. He flexed his bloody fingers. Or, he said, we can fight them. Together. You watch my back, I watch yours. We kill every single one of them, and then, when the snow settles, you can decide what you want to do with me. I looked at his hand. I looked at the dark woods where the engines were screaming closer. I took a deep breath, pushing the betrayal down into a tight, hard knot in my stomach. I would deal with him later. I would make him pay later. Right now, I had a job to do. I reached out and gripped his bloody hand. Don't make me regret this, Ghost, I warned. You won't, he promised, pulling me toward the storm. Now, let's go hunting. We stopped running. Prey runs. Predators hunt. The shift in our dynamic was silent, absolute, and terrifyingly effective. We moved through the whiteout of the blizzard not as two desperate fugitives, but as a single, multi-limbed organism designed for violence. The forest, with its screaming wind and blinding snow, wasn't an obstacle anymore. It was our camouflage. It was the curtain we stood behind before we stepped out to kill. I took point. I was smaller, faster, invisible in the drifts. The viper had returned to her natural habitat. I moved in a low crouch, my boots finding purchase on the ice, slicked roots. My breathing synced to the howling wind. Behind me, a dark shadow in a torn hospital gown and a blood-stained parka, was the Ghost King. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. A flick of my fingers to the left meant hostiles. A tap on my thigh meant hold. A clenched fist meant kill. He understood every signal before I finished making it. It was a tactical intimacy that felt more invasive and more electric than any touch. We heard them before we saw them. The high-pitched whine of two snowmobiles cutting through the timber. They were moving slowly, sweeping the grid, searching for the cripple and the girl. I signaled, ambush. L shape. Won-Seog nodded. He melted into the thick trunk of an ancient pine, bracing the stolen rifle against the bark. He was the hammer. I was the scalpel. I moved ahead, 10 yards up the trail. I didn't have a rifle. I had my knife and my pistol. I needed to be close. I needed to be the bait. I took the silver thermal blanket from my pack, the one that had covered him in the cabin. I snagged it on a low branch, letting it flutter violently in the wind, a flash of unnatural color in the monochrome world. Then I buried myself in a snowdrift 5 feet away, packing the powder over my legs, becoming nothing more than a bump in the ground. The snowmobiles rounded the bend. The lead driver saw the blanket immediately. He raised a fist, signaling a halt. Contact, a voice crackled over the wind. I see the blanket. Visual on target. They were arrogant. They didn't flank. They rode right up to it, their engines idling with a throaty rumble that vibrated in my chest. The lead rider dismounted, his MP5 raised, stepping toward the fluttering silver plastic. He was 5 feet from me. 4. 3. He reached out to pull the blanket down. Clear, he shouted. It's just a crack. The sound of Won-Seog's rifle was a flat, dry snap. The second rider, the one still on the machine, covering his partner, jerked backward. A dark hole appeared in the center of his visor. He slumped over the handlebars, his thumb jamming the throttle. The snowmobile roared, spinning its track in the air, engine screaming. The first driver spun around, panicked by the noise and the sudden death of his partner. He exposed his back to me. I erupted from the snow. I didn't shoot him. Gunshots are loud. Knives are final. I drove my blade into the gap between his helmet and his tactical vest, severing the spinal cord. He dropped without a sound, his body instantly limp. I dragged him into the tree line before he hit the ground, stripping his radio and his sidearm. I looked back at the pine tree. Won-Seog stepped out, lowering the rifle. He gave me a single, sharp nod. Clean. We scavenged what we could: ammo, grenades, a fresh radio, and disabled the snowmobiles. We couldn't use them, the noise would give us away. We were hunting the head of the snake, and snakes feel vibration. 2 down, Won-Seog murmured, his voice rough but steady. Kang will be getting impatient. Kang? I asked, checking the magazine of the stolen MP5. "My lieutenant. The one who was supposed to be guarding the perimeter of the hospital," he replied, his eyes dark. "He's leading this sweep. I recognize his tactics. He likes to push from the center. Then we break the center," I said. We moved deeper into the woods, following the tire tracks back toward the main road. The adrenaline was a drug, sharpening my senses until the world seemed to move in slow motion. I could smell the ozone of the storm, the metallic tang of fresh blood on my gloves, and the scent of pine crushed under boots. We found them 20 minutes later. A blockade. A heavy armored transport vehicle was parked on the logging road, flanked by 3 men. They were setting up a mobile command post, trying to get a signal through the storm. And there, standing by the hood of the truck, was a man in a white trench coat. Kang. He was screaming into a handset, his face twisted in frustration. "Find them. The man is an invalid. He can't walk 50 yards without assistance. Stop making excuses and burn the forest if you have to." We were prone behind a fallen log, 30 yards away. The snow was piling up on our backs, freezing us into the landscape. Won-Seog shifted beside me, his shoulder pressed against mine. I could feel the tension in his frame, not fear, but a coiled, murderous rage. "That's him," he whispered. "The man who held the elevator for me every morning for 5 years. He thinks you're weak," I whispered back. "He thinks I'm helpless. Let's correct him." "I have an idea," I murmured. "Cover your ears." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming canister I had swiped from the cabin's emergency kit. Bear mace, high-pressure capsaicin. I looked at the wind direction. It was blowing directly from us toward the truck. A perfect gale-force tailwind. On my mark, I signaled. I pulled the pin on a flashbang grenade I had taken from the dead snowmobile driver. I threw it high and long. Bang. The explosion was blinding in the whiteout, a magnesium star that erased all shadows. The men by the truck screamed, covering their eyes, blinded by the flash. "Move," I yelled. We broke cover. I didn't run to shoot. I ran to spray. I depressed the trigger of the bear mace, spraying a thick orange fog into the wind. The gale caught it, carrying it instantly into the faces of the blinded men. They gagged, coughing violently as the chemical burned their lungs and eyes. They were combat effective 0. I moved through the orange mist like a wraith. Pop, pop, pop. 3 controlled shots. 3 men down. I reached the truck. Kang was there, rubbing his streaming eyes, swinging his pistol blindly. "Who's there?" he screamed, mucus running from his nose. "Show yourself." I kicked his legs out from under him. He hit the ice hard. Before he could scramble up, a boot slammed onto his chest. A heavy boot. Kang froze. He blinked, tears streaming down his face, trying to clear his vision. He looked up. Standing over him, framed by the swirling snow and the orange mist, was the Ghost King. Won-Seog held the rifle in one hand, pointing it casually at Kang's forehead. He looked immense, terrifying. "Hello, Kang," Won-Seog said. His voice was smooth, devoid of the gravel, devoid of the weakness. It was the voice of the Emperor. Kang's eyes went wide. "Boss, sir, it was Choi. He forced me. He said you were brain dead. And you didn't check?" Won-Seog asked, tilting his head. "Careless, please. I can help you. I can get you back into the city." "I have help," Won-Seog said, gesturing to me. Kang looked at me. He sneered, a flicker of his old arrogance breaking through the fear. "Her? The help? You're trusting your life to the woman who scrubs the toilets?" I stepped forward. I didn't shout. I didn't rage. I leaned down, bringing my face close to his. "I didn't just scrub the toilets, Kang," I whispered, my voice cold and flat. "I took out your trash. I sanitized your crime scenes. And right now, I'm the one deciding if you're a stain I need to remove." I stood up and looked at Won-Seog. "He's all yours." Won-Seog didn't hesitate. He didn't monologue. He pulled the trigger. Click. Empty chamber. Kang let out a breath of relief, reaching for his backup piece. But Won-Seog didn't need a bullet. He reversed the rifle, gripping the barrel like a club. He brought the stock down with a savage, primal roar, smashing it into Kang's skull. It was brutal. It was personal. It was the king reclaiming his throne with blood and bone. When it was over, the silence of the forest rushed back in. Won-Seog stood there, breathing heavily, the broken rifle in his hand. He was covered in snow, blood, both his own and others, and the grime of the hunt. I walked over to the armored truck. It was running. The heater was blasting. It was a ticket out of hell. I climbed into the driver's seat and looked back at him. He was staring at his hands, then at the dead body of his lieutenant. "Get in," I called out. "Unless you want to walk to Seoul." He dropped the rifle and climbed into the passenger seat. The warmth of the cab hit us instantly, stinging our frozen skin. He looked at me, really looked at me. His eyes traced the blood on my cheek, the way I gripped the steering wheel, the cold deadness in my eyes that had replaced the maid's subservience. "We need to get to the safe zone," I said, putting the truck in gear. "Then, I'm gone. I did my job. I'm not going back to cleaning floors, Won-Seog. Not for you. Not for anyone." He reached out, his hand covering mine on the gear shift. His grip was warm, firm, and electric. "I never intended for you to clean floors, Tamika," he said, his voice low and intense, promising a future that was darker and more dangerous than anything I had signed up for. "I intended for you to own them." I stared at him, my heart skipping a beat. The engine roared as I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the mountain road, leaving the bodies and the Maid uniform behind in the snow. The Dragon's Nest didn't look like a headquarters. It looked like a shard of black glass piercing the heart of Seoul. 80 stories of steel, arrogance, and impenetrable security. To the public, it was the Lim Corporation, a titan of shipping and logistics. To the underworld, it was the throne room of the Ghost King. And we were walking up to the back door. We didn't take the main lobby with its marble floors and metal detectors. We took the alley. The service entrance. The domain of the invisible. I stopped at the heavy steel door marked maintenance and deliveries only. It was scratched, covered in grime, and smelled of wet cardboard and old grease. I looked at Won-Seog. He was leaning against the brick wall, his face pale under the streetlights, his breath visible in the damp night air. The bullet wound in his shoulder from the mountain was bandaged tight, but he was losing blood. He looked like a wreck, but his eyes were alive. They burned with a cold, terrifying anticipation. "Do you have the key?" he asked, his voice low. I reached into my pocket. I hadn't carried a weapon into this building for 3 years. I had carried a plastic key card, chipped at the corner, that gave me access to the laundry chutes and the trash compactors. "I never returned it," I whispered. I swiped the card. The reader buzzed green. The irony wasn't lost on me. The billions of ones spent on biometric scanners and armed guards in the lobby, and the king was retaking his castle using a maid's keycard. We slipped inside. The service corridor was a familiar world of humming pipes and flickering fluorescent lights. We moved fast. I took point, clearing the corners. We encountered a single guard by the freight elevator. He was young, bored, scrolling on his phone. He didn't even hear me. I choked him out before he could look up, dragging his unconscious body into a supply closet. I took his earpiece and his sidearm. We stepped into the freight elevator. It was a metal box that smelled of industrial cleaner, the smell of my old life. I hit the button for the 80th floor. The ascent was agonizingly slow. The gears ground together, pulling us up toward the sky. "Choi will be in the penthouse," Won-Seog said, leaning heavily against the metal wall. "He likes the view. He thinks looking down on the city makes him a god. He's about to find out gravity is a bitch," I muttered, checking the slide on my stolen pistol. "Tamika." I looked at him. "When those doors open," he said, his gaze locking onto mine, "there is no turning back. You kill everyone who isn't me. No hesitation. No mercy." "I don't do mercy," I replied. "I do invoices. And they are all past due." The elevator chimed. The doors slid open, revealing not a hallway, but the expansive, open-plan foyer of the penthouse suite. It was a masterpiece of minimalism, white marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and abstract art that cost more than a small country. And it was full of men. 6 guards. 3 by the windows, 3 by the double mahogany doors that led to the inner office. They turned, surprised to see the freight elevator open. They expected a catering cart. They got the Viper. I stepped out, firing. Pop, pop. Pop, pop. 2 guards dropped before they could unholster their weapons. The room exploded into chaos. I moved laterally, using a marble pillar for cover. Glass shattered as they returned fire, shards raining down like diamonds. Won-Seog didn't hide. He walked out behind me. He didn't run. He strode. He raised the rifle we had taken from the mountain, firing with a calm, rhythmic precision. Boom. Boom. 2 more guards fell. It was a massacre. The synergy we had found in the woods translated perfectly to the boardroom. I went low, sliding across the polished floor, taking out the knees of the 5th guard. I finished him with a knife hand to the throat. Won-Seog put a round through the chest of the 6th. Silence returned, punctuated only by the heavy breathing of the dying and the hum of the air conditioning. We walked to the double doors. Won-Seog didn't knock. He kicked them open. Director Choi was sitting behind the massive obsidian desk. Won-Seog's desk. He looked exactly as I remembered from the dossiers. Slick, middle-aged, wearing a suit that shimmered under the recessed lighting. He was holding a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He didn't look terrified. He looked annoyed. "You're late," Choi said, setting the glass down. "I expected you to die 3 hours ago." "I took the scenic route," Won-Seog rasped, stepping into the room. Choi laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He looked at me, his eyes raked over my torn uniform, my bloodied hands, the gun at my side. "And you brought the help," he sneered. "Tamika Smith, the widow, the debt case." He opened a drawer and tossed a thick envelope onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. "There's 500,000 in there," Choi said, his voice dripping with false generosity. "That clears your husband's medical bills. That buys you a house in the country. That buys you a new life. All you have to do is put a bullet in the cripple standing next to you and walk away." I looked at the envelope. It was everything I had worked for. Everything I had suffered for. Freedom. I looked at Won-Seog. He didn't look at me. He was watching Choi, waiting. He wasn't going to beg. He was letting me choose. I looked back at Choi. "My husband is dead," I said, my voice echoing in the large room. "And my debt isn't money anymore. It's blood." I raised my gun. But I was too slow. Not for Choi, but for the shadow in the corner. A side door I hadn't checked burst open. A hidden bodyguard, Choi's personal insurance policy, stepped out with a shotgun. He wasn't aiming at Won-Seog. He was aiming at me. I saw the muzzle flash. No. Won-Seog moved. It was a blur of motion that defied his injuries. He threw himself across the space between us, slamming into me, knocking me sideways. The shotgun roared. Won-Seog grunted, a wet, sickening sound. The buckshot caught him in the side, spinning him around. He crashed to the floor, blood spraying across the white marble. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a tactical decision. It wasn't a military maneuver. It was a primal, screaming tear in the fabric of my soul. The Viper didn't just wake up. She went nuclear. I didn't check on Won-Seog. I rolled to my feet, my vision tunneling into a red haze. I shot the bodyguard in the face. 1 shot. He hit the wall and slid down. My gun clicked empty. Choi was fumbling for a weapon in his desk. I didn't reload. I sprinted. I vaulted over the obsidian desk, landing on him like a predator taking down a stag. He screamed, trying to push me off, but I was possessed. I pinned him to his high-backed leather chair. "You don't get to shoot him." I screamed, my hands scrambling for a weapon on the desk. "You don't get to touch him." My hand closed around something cold and heavy. Won-Seog's fountain pen. A Mont Blanc masterpiece. Heavy platinum barrel. Iridium nib. Sharp as a needle. I didn't hesitate. I drove the pen into Choi's neck. He gurgled, his eyes bulging. His hands clawed at my arms, but his strength was fading instantly. Ink and blood mixed, pooling on his expensive shirt, turning the white silk into a grotesque, dark purple canvas. "I quit," I whispered into his ear as the light faded from his eyes. I shoved his body backward. The chair toppled over, taking the usurper down with it. I stood there, chest heaving, my hands covered in the ink-blood mixture. The silence in the room was deafening. "Tamika." The voice was weak. I spun around. Won-Seog was pushing himself up. He was pale, deathly pale, and his side was a mess of shredded fabric and flesh. But he was alive. I ran to him, dropping to my knees, my hands hovering over his wounds, terrified to touch him, terrified I would make it worse. "You idiot," I choked out, tears finally stinging my eyes. "You jumped in front of a shotgun. Who does that? You're the king. You don't take bullets for the help." He reached up, his bloody hand cupping my cheek. He smeared red across my skin, marking me. "I told you," he whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "I don't have help. I have a partner." The double doors opened again. I grabbed my empty gun, spinning around, ready to fight the entire Korean army with the butt of a pistol. But it wasn't enemies. Men in dark suits poured into the room. Dozens of them. They saw the bodies. They saw Choi dead behind the desk. They saw the Ghost King bleeding on the floor. They stopped. Then, one by one, they dropped to their knees. They lowered their heads to the floor. It was a wave of submission, a silent acknowledgement of the hierarchy. The king had returned, and he had bathed the room in blood to prove it. Won-Seog didn't look at them. He ignored the army bowing at his feet. He kept his eyes locked on mine. He used the desk to pull himself up to a standing position. He swayed, but he stood. He was covered in gore, ruined and magnificent. He gestured to the room, to the kneeling men, to the city lights burning outside the shattered windows. "The throne is mine," he said, his voice gaining strength, ringing with absolute authority. He looked down at me, his eyes dark with a promise that terrified and thrilled me. "But the kingdom?" he whispered. "The kingdom is yours if you want it." The gray uniform burned 6 months ago. I watched it turn to ash in the incinerator, the smell of cheap polyester replacing the scent of bleach that had defined my life for 3 years. Now, the air in the dragon's nest smells of white tea, ozone, and absolute power. I sat behind the obsidian desk, the same desk where I had ended Director Choi's tenure with a fountain pen. Mr. Tanaka, a representative from the Osaka syndicate, sat opposite me. He was sweating, despite the perfect climate control of the penthouse. He kept glancing at the pen I was idly twirling between my fingers. A Mont Blanc. Platinum barrel. Sharp nib. "We feel that the transition period has been difficult," Tanaka stammered, wiping his upper lip. "Perhaps a reduction in the tariff for the Busan ports would demonstrate good faith." I stopped twirling the pen. The sound of the platinum hitting the obsidian was soft, but it made Tanaka flinch. "Mr. Tanaka," I said, my voice low and smooth. I wasn't shouting. I didn't need to. "I noticed you checked your watch 3 times in the last minute. You have a flight to catch. Or perhaps you're waiting for a signal?" His eyes widened. The color drained from his face. "I also noticed your bodyguard is left-handed, but he's carrying his weapon on his right hip," I continued, leaning back in the chair. My suit was Italian silk, midnight blue, tailored specifically to conceal the Glock 43 strapped to my ribs. "That tells me he's not a bodyguard. He's a sacrificial lamb you hired this morning because you were too afraid to bring your real security detail into my house." Tanaka opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "The tariff stands at 15%, I said, sliding the dossier toward him. "Pay it, or I start seizing your shipments. You have until you reach the elevator to decide." Tanaka didn't argue. He grabbed the file, bowed so low his nose nearly touched the carpet, and scrambled out of the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut. "You terrified him," a voice rumbled from the shadows near the balcony. Lim Won-Seog stepped into the light. He looked better than he had in years. The limp was gone, replaced by the prowling grace of a predator in his prime. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my old apartment, but his eyes were the same, dark, hungry, and fixated on me. He needed to be terrified, I replied, standing up and walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city of Seoul sprawled below us, a galaxy of lights that we now owned. He thought because I was a woman, I would be soft. He forgot that the female of the species is usually the one that bites. Won-Seog moved behind me. I didn't tense up. I leaned back, letting his chest support me. His arms wrapped around my waist, his hands resting possessively over the silk of my jacket, right above where my gun sat. The shadows found the last of Choi's loyalists in Incheon. He murmured against my ear, his breath warm. They're being handled. Good, I said. Clean house. He chuckled, a low vibration against my spine. You never stop cleaning, do you, Tamika? Old habits, I whispered, turning in his arms to face him. He looked down at me. There was no deception in his eyes anymore, no hidden cameras, no feigned comas. Just raw, unadulterated admiration. He ran a thumb over my lower lip, tracing the shape of it. You look natural here, he said softly, sitting in that chair, commanding men who used to look right through you. I was never invisible, Won-Seog, I reminded him. People just chose not to see me. I see you, he vowed. I see the viper. I see the queen. He tightened his grip on my waist, pulling me flush against him. The friction was electric, a reminder that while the war was over, the fire between us was just getting started. You own the floors now, Viper, he whispered, his eyes searching mine, challenging me. What else do you want to conquer? I smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of my lips that matched the predatory glint in his eyes. I reached up, tangling my fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him down to me. The world, Ghost, I replied, starting with you.
I was absolutely locked on this story.